Helen's connection with Gawler goes back to 1983, when she and her husband bought their first house here. It is now the Williston Bookshop, which is a great shop and a great house. So she gets to visit that house on a regular basis. In 1985, Helen established the Gawler Public Library and its local history collection. She was involved in the commissioning of Dr. Derek Whitelock's History of Gawler in 1989. That's a really good book. I've got that one at home. And she was working alongside councillors Betty Jacob and Mark Byrne, and community members Sue Coldbeck and Margaret Leake. Having been a librarian, a teacher, a local historian and a community engagement officer with the CFS, Helen now gets to devote her time to researching and writing about Gawler's history. She's a community representative on Council's Gawler Cultural Heritage Committee and a volunteer with the Cultural Heritage Centre. She's also the current chairperson of the Friends of Williston Cemetery and the Gawler Cultural Heritage Foundation. Helen is a member of the History Council of South Australia and the South Australian Historical Society. In 2019, she was awarded the title of South Australian Regional Historian by the History Council of South Australia. So, well done, Helen. Well done.
Okay, so yes, let's kick off. I've got quite a few slides and hopefully we'll get through it in time to go across and have a look at the church afterwards. But I'll do a shameless plug too, like Martin has. There's another History Month event coming up on the Monday the 16th, which is a film about the restoration of the grave that was undertaken by Paul Westman, who I saw walk into this room a little earlier. There you are, Paul. It's a 25-minute documentary film that's being shown down at the Gawler Civic Centre, and it'll be good. So I encourage people to come along and listen. Okay, here we are. Here's St George's Church. Now, I need to control it. And I'd just like to acknowledge the country that we meet on tonight. It's, of course, the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. We also pay respects to the cultural authority of Aboriginal people visiting from other areas of South Australia or Australia who might be here this evening. Okay, so tonight's talk, as I said, we're going to, I'll give you a brief overline, and I have to admit, right up, that I'm probably not the only expert on this topic. In fact, I don't consider myself to be an expert. All I've done is research that. I'm quite sure that within the people here in this room, there is information that I'm not aware of, and what I'm really looking forward to is you coming and talking to me later or contacting me later and saying, you've got that wrong, or there's a bit that's missing, because that's the whole point of it for me, is that revisiting this topic, this is a chance to draw even more information out from the community. So that's good. But there's some other topics, so we're going to go across to the church tonight. I'm just waiting for Joyce or Joanna to turn up. I'm sure that'll happen. But I should also point out that there are three other events this month about St George's. There's an open day, as you can see, on Saturday the 14th. And then there's going to be a cemetery tour of St George's, and I've had a little preview of that, and that is going to be terrific. If you haven't been up there and had somebody walk you around that cemetery, you'll find it fascinating. And then the National Trust here in Gawler, down the main street, they've got an exhibition of Gawler's early education, which includes a lot of St George's day books, so and the stories behind the pupils, which Margaret House has been involved with, and Margaret's here too. So can I give that a plug? That'll be really interesting. Okay, and as I said before, I stand on the shoulders of many other people, and I'd just like to acknowledge them. And there's a whole list there of people who contributed and helped me with this recently, and in some cases, like Fred and Brian, going way back to when I first did this study in 1990. And one of those people, or one of them I'd like to point out at the end, the town of Gawler, the Gawler Heritage Collection, they've given me permission tonight to show you two images that are really, I don't think they've been seen before. So I've got special permission to put those in the slides, so you're going to see some new stuff as well. Martin Walker has also very generously shared some of the things from his collection, and for those of you who've heard Martin, will know there's some treasures coming up. And there is one of the Church Hill photography. Neil Jacobs from Church Hill took that, I believe, using one of his drones. So for me, that's a particularly beautiful image, because not only do you see the lovely church with the slate roof, but you get to see, you know, the surrounding areas that it sits within. So I particularly like that one. Okay, now the good thing about St George's is that lots of people have written things about it. So one of the first things I did for this was to go and do a bit of a literature review. And there's 2 pages going all the way back to George Loyau in 1880. But on a regular basis, people have written or updated the history of the church. So having brought them together, I'm going to make sure that the Gawler Heritage Collection has a copy of everything. So people who would like to come and... This reading list will go up on the Gawler History website, but I'll also make sure that, you know, there's a collection somewhere that people can come back and read. And that makes really interesting reading. Some of the authors disagree, so on small facts they'll, you know, you'll go, oh, hang on, he said that, she said that type of thing. But they're all useful. There's a second page, goes on, and there's, of course, Trixie MacDonald's great book, which most of you will be familiar with, and the Gawler History team, which have been collecting stuff on St George's and putting up images as well. And not to discount the fact that the Gawler Anglican Parish has a particularly useful website with resources as well, so that's worthwhile. And 2 of the seminal South Australian history books, Douglas Pike and Paradise of Descent, and David Hilliard and his work on churches in South Australia. They're both very useful, and I know they are in the Gawler Heritage Collection, so just if you're interested. Okay, just help me, I'll just keep moving stuff. Right, easier said than done. Okay, so how did I get to be standing here tonight? It's Brian Thomas' fault, of course. We miss him very much. But Brian was very much aware that in 1990 I did a study. I actually enrolled to do a graduate diploma in local history because I was taking maternity leave from the council, and I thought I'd be bored and have nothing to do. First-time parent problem, that one. So anyway, I enrolled and really enjoyed the course, and Brian was very helpful in helping me access, because the 2 of the assignments I decided to do on St George's. I've always had a history, an interest in church architecture and cemeteries going way back, and it seemed to me that St George's would be a good place to start. So he knew I'd done that, and he also had a copy of my work that I'd done in 1990, the assignments. And so about 3 or 4 years ago, he called me and said, we need an update, Helen. So, of course, I did as I was told, and I prepared this. So, surprisingly, 3 or 4 years is the trick, because, of course, you say yes, and it's way off. And then it comes closer and closer, and then you start to panic. But never mind, it's been done now. So, yeah, I'm using this as an opportunity. It's given me, after 30 plus years, it's been interesting to review what's been discovered, and there has been some interesting discoveries about St George's and where it fits in Gawler's history, so I found it very interesting, and it's useful to bring it all together. Okay, so St George's has always played an important role in Gawler's history, and through a whole range of aspects, and in trying to put some structure behind this talk, I started to look at different aspects. So there we are. We're going to very quickly go through all of those different things. So, but before we do, to use Lewis Carroll's things, let's go back to the beginning, because I think we need a little bit of context in history to understand where St George's came from. So most of you would know that in England the state church is called the Church of England, and has been since Henry VIII sorted it out and reduced the influence of the Pope and the Catholic Church, let's say. So it became the dominant, in fact the only church in some respects in England. But in the late 17th century, in 1689, they brought in a Toleration Act, allowing for dissenting groups to establish their own places of worship. But despite having that, there was still lots of intolerance. If you didn't belong to the Church of England, you couldn't work in the government, and that went on for a very long time. So it's a fairly rigid and established system. So the people that came from England to settle Gawler were used to that system. However, this term dissenters and non-conformists arose in England, and that was the people who wished to distance themselves from the state church. And that reflects in South Australia because prominent London dissenters, Congregationalist Robert Gouger and Baptist George Fife Angus, got interested in the Quaker called Edmund Wakefield's colonisation plan, and those names we'll all recognise. Oh, I'm so pleased you're here. Welcome, Joyce. This is our keys to the church, people. So
I'm going to go over there.
That's okay. Please stay and listen. So yes, once we had those dissenters and non-conformists, what we had is so one of the founding pillars for South Australia was that we were going to have religious equality and freedom, not just tolerance. And for those of you who have Wakefield's plan will see that that's going. Up until this point, all the British colonies, the government had given money to the Church of England and sometimes to the Church of Scotland and even to the Roman Catholics to enable them to establish churches. And they did that on the basis that religion was really important and the only basis for a stable and civilised social order. So they saw a value in establishing churches and church schools. But South Australia wasn't going to be like that. And we suddenly had this debate emerge between what was called volunteerism, where you do it yourself. If you want a church, if you want a church school, you're going to have to raise the funds. You're not going to rely on the government, which was called volunteerism. And then we had the other side where the state would start to support. In fact, the bill that led to the establishment of South Australia had no mention, no provision whatsoever for financial support for churches. But surprisingly, as it was going through Parliament, there was a clause suddenly added, and we were going to have a colonial chaplain who would be paid from government funds. So the theory was good, the philosophy was there, but in practice it was a debate that went back and forth, and would continue to go back and forth for a long time in South Australia, and we even hear echoes of it today about whether private schools should get the same funding as state schools. It's still a remnant of that idea about whether we should have religious freedom and tolerance and all the rest of it, the church remaining separate from the state from that. Anyway, there we go. But in 1844, so what happened is the Church of England then started to come in and provide funds, and there were a variety of different societies that would provide funds for the churches being built and the schools starting here in South Australia. And we'll see some of these names, particularly the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, popping up as we go through this presentation. And just to show you, in 1844, so what's that? Less than a decade after South Australia was settled by Europeans, we only had 54% of the population was Church of England. So we had a lot of dissenters and we had Catholics as well. So they were barely in the majority of the population. So again, people coming from England, from a system that they've generationally grown up to a new situation here in South Australia. Okay, so let's look first about where St George's is, here in Gawler. We all know William Light. When he created his 1839 plan of Gawler, he actually assigned space for 4 churches, and they were all in the squares: Church of England, Catholic, Presbyterian and Wesleyan. Except that Wesleyan wasn't in a square, and we'll have a look in a minute where that is. And that led, having so many churches, it led to the term, and I can't quite grasp when it first came in. I've got a feeling it's more of a 20th century term where we call Church Hill. We've got a real concentration of churches in this particular area that we're here tonight. Okay, so here we go. Here's the, where's my magic little, here we go. So, for those not familiar, we've got, of course, the square that the Catholic Church, Parnell Square, Orleana Square, Light Square was going to be the Presbyterians. The Wesleyans were out on the end of King Street, which at that stage would have been, that was the major road out of Gawler. But of course, they didn't. Neither the Wesleyans nor the Presbyterians built their churches where it was first planned. The Presbyterian, I've got it wrong, that's the Congregationalists. The Presbyterians went here, and there's a whole story about that. And the Wesleyans, of course, came down firstly into the old schoolhouse and then into the Todd Street area. And the other part that I've marked, of course, is the cemetery, the original cemetery between Anno's Pioneer Park. That was also part of the plan. And it's a little easier to see on this 1863 map. The cross up there is where the Wesleyans were going to be, roughly where Nurse Greenslade's and the Eagle Foundry is today. It was going to be in that area. And the Wesleyans, no, not happy with that, so they moved. I'm not quite sure, maybe they did a land swap, I'm not sure exactly how they ended up. Okay, let me keep going. And here's the first of Martin's lovely illustrations. There's an early postcard from his collection showing the four main, but in fact this is the Congregational, not the Presbyterian. So, yeah. Anyway, very early on. Okay, again, just to give you a rerun, right from the beginning we had church services here in Gawler. They were initially held in Clonley, which was the home of Jane and John Reid's place. They were occasionally led by the colonial chaplain, whose name was Charles Beaumont Howard, who would ride the 26 miles from town on his horse called Luther, and he would do the honours, running the service. But they were also run later by the Reid's sons' tutors, and there was one of them was actually an independent. So I'm sure that they had weekly services, but who led those services would obviously move around. But what we do know is that they were really social events, because Howard, who was actually one of the people who had land through the Special Survey, he's one of the land owners from the Special Survey, he was an Irishman just like John Reid, and he played a very fine fiddle. So there's reports of it being, they'd have this church service and then they would party on. So I think it's that stands, that's setting a good tone for Gawler, and I think we continue today. Okay, in 1845 there was a second colonial chapel called James Farrell, and he called together a meeting of members and friends of the Church of England, and I've done the highlight of friends there. And they together raised £100 for the building of a church at Gawler, the first one north of Adelaide. So I think there was a lot of influential people. It was not just local people. I think there were people in Adelaide who were keen to see. They were starting to move north anyway for settlement and for business, and they were very keen to see a church established here. And just to show you that scandal and gossip isn't a recent thing, as I was researching, James Farrell, who was actually initially Howard's assistant, when Charles Howard died, ended up marrying his widow, and there was quite a lot of scandal about it. So there you go. Just goes to show. There was a committee appointed, and you start to recognise some of those names again: Stephen King, Grant, Butler, Younghusband and Stubbs. The names that are underlined are all people who commissioned and then ended up owning land in Gawler as part of the Special Survey. So it makes sense. They had an investment in Gawler, so they were involved in organising to get the first church up and running. That committee was quite canny and applied for government grants to assist with the building of a church or parsonages and for the payment of clergymen. Now hang on, didn't I just say that South Australia wasn't going to do that? That we weren't going to provide money to provide churches? Well, here you go. For a short period, for something like six years, there was something called the state aid system. The government of the time chose to provide some fundings to kickstart churches across South Australia. Didn't last forever, but Gawler was well organised and well connected to make good use of that. So we struck lucky. Okay, and that committee ended up choosing an architect for this church, and it's a gentleman's name you'll recognise, George Strickland Kingston, who went on to do wonderful things. He became a Member of Parliament and the first Speaker for the House Assembly, and he was eventually knighted. But he is remembered in South Australia. Ayers House, the original part of Government House, the jail, and the Treasury building. So when you look at our St George's, I mean, you can think it's got a lot in common with some of the most substantial buildings in South Australia. So again, it's a significant building, not only for Gawler, but in South Australia as well. Okay, and then, moving quite quickly, in November 1846, the first resident minister arrived, William Henry Coombes. Now, Coombes is spelt with an S, C-O-O-M-B-S. Coombe, who's the other guy that I'm interested in, is C-O-O-M-B-E. And across our history, through poor handwriting, the S and the E have got mixed up, and it's constant. Even Coombe Street here in Gawler is spelt with the E on the end, but was there long before. It's actually named for this guy, not the editor of the Bunyip. But anyway, just a little. And his stipend, his salary and his passage was actually paid from the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. So he came at Governor Gawler's request. He was one of four ministers that they brought across. As soon as he got here, he started holding regular services. The first ones were in the basement of the original Victoria Mill, which is in Jacob Street, or it was in Jacob Street. It isn't there. All that's left now is the mill house. And they then moved to the public schoolhouse, which was located about opposite where the community house is now. And in fact, there was a number of churches that had their service in that building. Excuse me. And he performed marriages out at Floraville, which is on the North Para and was the home or the property of William Younghusband, and that's where Canon Coombes, he was Reverend at the stage, lived. And a picture there that comes out from the art gallery of Floraville. So, moving very quickly, so November we've got I keep calling him Canon Coombes because that's what he ended up, but Canon Coombes arrived. March next year, they were actually laying the foundation. So there was no holding them back. They had the money, they had the will, they got on, and they had the governor, no less, come out and lay the foundation stone of the church. The church obviously was named for the English patron saint, and also in honour of Governor Gawler. And at that, Governor Gawler, of course, had returned by that stage, yes. Just check my notes here. But his mother, this interesting woman called Julia Hutchinson, was there. And she is really intriguing. Now, just bear with me, because, here we go. Yes, Governor Gawler went back in 1841, as you remember. He was recalled. He and his wife Maria left the colony, but his mother Julia stayed, as did their eldest daughter, who by that time had married a local man, George Hall. Governor Gawler's son Henry returned in 1858, just a year before Julia died, at the age of 90 in North Adelaide. So what is that? Why has she stayed? What did she do? You know, and she must have, it sounds like she kept in contact with the church, St George's, for quite a while. But we know nothing about, well, very, very little about her. So at the end of this, I've put up a couple of things that I think bears some further research, and she's definitely on my list. So, okay. Right, again, a year later, a year after they've laid the foundation stone, the church is consecrated by the bishop, Augustus Short, and the rectory was begun. Up at Gulfview, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail, using more money, a grant, and at this time also a grant of land from the government. They started a school and completed it. And that was another government grant. So we were pretty good at getting in there, getting organised and getting the money to do it. So shows tenacity, and I think it shows a really good network of support in Adelaide as well. Now, there we go. This is a picture that comes from the Gawler Heritage Collection. It is not dissimilar to a sketch that we know exists about the St Peter's and Paul, but this one is 1848, and it shows the first St George's without any tower, and the schoolhouse at the back, which is now where the playground is. So you can see, I mean, it's only Gawler's established in 1839, and within 9 years we have a church and we have a fairly substantial schoolhouse there. It just shows how we got on and got going. And it's interesting to see this, because we'll talk about this. This is the first church, and it unfortunately didn't survive, but there's a bit of a story of that as well. And this shows that Gawler, again, knew how to party. And I will read this to you. On Tuesday last, the 21st instant, St George's Church Gawler was concentrated by the Right Reverend the Lord Bishop of Adelaide. About 200 respectively dressed people, including a goodly number of visitants from Adelaide, attended, and some score of the Gawler Oddfellows proceeded in procession to the church dressed in their regalia. After the consecration, His Lordship delivered an appropriate sermon using a simple gospel of Jesus. In the evening, some of the apparently most devout throughout the proceedings of the day took rather a peculiar method of evincing the depth of their sanctity by indulging pretty freely in certain libations that bore rather a suspicious similitude to the fag end of a jubilee or the dying throbs of a Nician carnival. They all went out and got blottoed. I like that, and I think that sets a very good tone for Gawler. Anyway, and then a year later, we're celebrating. We're having an Easter service, we're having a talk, a tea meeting and a talk from somebody who's been a midshipman in the schoolhouse. And for those of you who know, this is William Barnett doing a poster, and there's a similar poster that celebrates the Institute. So Barnett was in there providing, long before the Bunyip established, he was printing out these public notices that went out and about. So again, that's from the Gawler Cultural Heritage Collection. Oh, losing it. Okay, but yes, as I said, in 1851 there was a storm on Christmas Eve that did extensive damage to the church. And probably because it was built so quickly, it was a bit vulnerable to that. Sadly, considering it was at the end of the year, the very next year that state aid system stopped. So they were a bit of a pickle, because they knew they weren't going to be in a situation to get more money from the government to rebuild the church, so they had to have a different thought. And the very next year they went off and bought a barrel organ. That was important, but they also took advice, and they made a decision not to extensively repair the church. They would build a new one. But that, as we will see, wasn't an instant thing. It wasn't knock one down, build the other one. It took quite a long time. So they set about raising funds, and they thought they'd need about £1,500 to do that. And there's another name coming in. John Riddell was certainly on that committee as well. So we start to see here the same Gawler names coming in, being involved. Interestingly, you'll see there, in 1857 they sent George Warren, who was a surveyor, out to survey Orleana Square, because there was some dispute, and 1857 is when the council started, the corporation of the town of Gawler. There was a dispute about which land belonged to the church and which would be council land. So George Warren went out to survey it, and then they knew. And again, there's reams in the Bunyip, the very first ones talking about that. And the new church was to be designed by the colonial architect by the name of Edward Angus Hamilton. And he chose a very much 14th century traditional style church. So that was the design that he chose, but of course he would have had to go back through the committee to do that. And if you know, again, we're talking about other churches that are connected. So Hamilton also did extensions to the Government House and Treasury House. He did the jail up at Borough, for those of you who know. He was involved, Hamilton Church out at Hamilton, the Institute building on North Terrace. He also designed the telegraph, Martin, the telegraph station here in Gawler. That was a Hamilton one. And for St George's, he chose to use local bluestone and the sandstone from the local quarries, and then, of course, the Welsh slate, which I believe, I've been told the tale that it came in as ballast in the early ships. I haven't been able to check that one. So, a bit in the Register, the Adelaide Register said the new church is to be built in the early English style, having a lofty tower, buttresses, and when completed will be a great ornament to the town. Architect E.H. Hamilton, Superintendent of Works would be Mr. D. Garlick. Now, Daniel Garlick is another Gawler name, and for many years he had a business in the Murray Street, and he is responsible for quite a lot of buildings of his own, both here, up at One Tree Hill, and many other places. He's quite well known in South Australia as a designing architect. Thankfully, a distinctive name, so you can track him quite well. Now, I've stuck a little map in because I know that I'm a bit of a... I know the words about church architecture, but it's not that common. So I'm going to use some names here, and I've tried to indicate where in the church it would be. So in 1858, the foundation of the new church was laid, and that would have been down in this end. So you have to imagine the existing church, the first church, is still there. They didn't knock it down. They started building the new church to the west, or in front of the church. And they built, the first thing they did is they built this area here, this side of the blue line. So they put the foundation stone in, and I believe we still haven't been able to find where that foundation stone is. No, thank you, Bev. We're still looking. And 3 years later, they put the keystone of the tower arch. So that was in the plans. So they put the keystone in there, and it was done with full Masonic honours by the Mayor, James Barton. And 3 years after that, so they're moving along, they actually opened this. Which is, so if you imagine, they've still, my guess is it actually you could walk through from one church to another. So they still had plenty of room, but what they had is a damaged church and a new section side by side. In 1884 they were going to start building the tower, and they'd actually selected an architect for that, but a decision was made to delay the tower and instead pull down the old building and get on with building the rest of the church, the transept and the chancel. And again, they had the wife of the then bishop, Henrietta Kenyon, come out and lay that foundation stone. So they were able to pull people from Adelaide to do the honours. You know, it was a church that right from the beginning was well connected with Adelaide, and people would travel back and forth. Here we go, there we go. Oh, no, I've gone on. Oh, going backwards. Right, Okay, so just to show you that the church does change, I want to reinforce that things don't happen instantly in the church. It was a lot of fundraising, it took time, they had to plan for it in stages. Here's a 1910 photo, again from Martin's collection, and here it is in 1922. So it's roughly, it's not exactly the same, but you can get a bit of an idea. 1910, they had the reredos, made of oak, and at the back behind the altar, which was then removed later. We'll talk about that. Made simpler, providing a bit more room. So the church does continue to change. And just to show you, that's a sketch that I made in 1990. And when I was going through my notes, I thought, hang on, I had the two aisles in 1990, but if we go backwards, how do I go backwards? No. There we go. Oh. So in 1910, we had a central aisle with central pews with two aisles. Today we've got just one aisle, And then in 1990 we were more like what we had in 1910. So again, as the church needs to, it will adapt, it will change its format, and you can see that when we look at the choirs and where they place the organs. So it continues to develop. It's not a set in stone, never changes type thing. Right, and I'm just going to now take you through some really nice photos. Thank you, Joyce. I've pinched these off the church website. For those of you not familiar, you get to see some of these. We'll see them again in a little while when we go across. But here you can see, remember we had, that was originally behind the altar. At some stage they made a lady chapel and they recycled some of that beautiful, beautiful oak into this new chapel. So although they changed, the church has managed to keep some of its treasures and reuse them, which is really lovely to see. And there's looking down from the altar down the other side, and you can get to see the choir loft. And for me, it's I think it's because it's been painted quite white. The light in it is spectacular, particularly with the stained glass. And you can start to see that there. And if you look carefully, and you'll see it tonight briefly, and when you come back to the open day, you'll see you'll have much more time to see some of their treasures, some of the things that are in that church that have been donated and put in as memorials are really quite spectacular and just whole Gawler's history. This is not a view that I see very often because I hate heights, but up there in that choir loft is a particularly lovely view. You get to see a whole, you get to see the magnificence of the ceiling and all the buttressing that's there. And here we go, going back. This is a 1909 version, and what I love about this is, look, we've got a stone wall all the way around the church land. And if you look carefully, if you walk it, you can see some remnants of that stone wall, but how magnificent it would have been. What a sense, coming down Cowan Street, it's a real sense of, arrival. You've got a church and you've got the wall all the way around. What a shame we've lost it, but never mind. And there's 1910. Oh, that's a rerun of the other one as well. But again, lots of trees, the wall, and then we've got the magnificent church dominated by the tower in the background. It's still there in we think it's a 1950, still there. Still, the wall is still there at that stage. Right, now we're going to deviate off into another little path. In doing the history, it's actually a parish church with quite a wide spread. In the English model, the rector was expected to travel widely and service parishioners in quite an area. So we start with St George's in Cowan. Oh, let's make that Oleander Square. I made a mistake. But he was also going down to Salisbury in the 1860s and providing services there. Then we had the Church of the Transfiguration, was built in 1895. We know it as Gawler South, but of course at that stage it would have been Bassett Town. There was also a church out of the Barossa Goldfields, and the rector went out there to preach as well. That really was the turn of the century. When the gold was discovered, he was going out and providing services, and then a church was actually built. But at some point later, that moved across, and that's now part of the Holy Trinity Church at Lyndoch. Services were also held on a monthly basis out at Roseworthy College, right from early days. And then when we had Smithfield Migrant Hostel, the rector was going down there and providing services as well as One Tree Hill, and then out to Two Wells and Malala, and then of course later, and we'll talk about that, St Trinity comes along as well. So that person, whoever was in the role, travelled quite widely, had a lot on their plate in terms of providing church services. Okay, there was also a number of church buildings, and this is what, for me, this started to become really interesting. So there we have at the top the first church. The foundation was laid in 1847, and it actually stayed until 1885, and then it was demolished. The schoolroom, which is where the playground is now, 1848, and that lasted to 91 before it was demolished. The Rectory, which is up at Gulfview, built the same year as the school, and it was sold in 1909. We had a second church, started to be built in 1858. So it and the original church lasted for, let me do my sums, 27 years. They were standing side by side. And then we had a second St George's schoolroom, which we now know as the Parish Hall. Then there was a second rectory, and then there was the Gawler South Hall. So quite a lot of property. So in terms of the parish and their responsibilities, they've owned quite a lot in Gawler, and it's changed. The ownership have changed as the needs have changed as well. And for those of you who know the Church of Transfiguration, I thought they were particularly lovely. Sometimes because we drive past so quick, we don't get to see it in all its glory, but it's down there. And that's got an interesting history all of its own, which I'm not really going to go into, but again, Trixie O'Connell does a particularly good history of that if you're interested. And then we've got the cemetery, and I'm not going to steal Joyce's thunder here, but just to remind you, it's 4 acres, and it's up there on the crest of the hill, and it was outside the town of Gawler, which is interesting. And it's quite a distance from the residences, and there's a reason for that. It was opened in 61, and it was actually the second of Gawler Cemetery. The original, of course, is down where we know now Pioneer Park, which was only 2 or 3 acres. But the problem with that was the drainage and the health issues. So it's one of the even though Light was using, he was using a tradition that almost immediately had ceased in England, where you put a cemetery in the centre of town. It became very obvious in England, as in terms of public health, that it wasn't clever to do that. And here in Gawler, where that cemetery is at the bottom of the escarpment, and every time it rains, the water comes racing down through the cemetery, and then it was going down the main street. And we had all type of waterborne diseases, and it became quite an issue. So eventually they closed it, and of course then we had, just beforehand, we had a new act that regulated cemeteries in South Australia, and we opened the Williston Cemetery in 1866, and that was much, much larger. So part of the interesting part, there are various people buried in various cemeteries, but it's all part of Gawler's history. And of course now we have a 4th cemetery within the council boundary, which is the Smithfield Memorial Park as well. So lots of places. It's a traditional east-west. Most of the graves are facing east-west, very much like the churches. It is, to me, I'm very fond of the Williston Cemetery, I'm very tied up with it, but this has got one of the best views ever. And in fact, I was talking to an elderly gentleman today who said, I chose it because I like the view and I think I'm going to enjoy the view forevermore. So my problem to him, he hasn't been there for a little while, is for those of you who've been up recently, Concordia is there, and already there's a few things starting to be built. So I wonder in 10 years whether the view will be quite, it'll always be magnificent, but it might not be quite as uncluttered as it is now. The good news is, if you go on this talk, you're going to find a lot more about the St George's Cemetery, but there is a really, really good online resource that has been developed, and you can go in, as I did here, and I was looking for Samuel Pope, who's part of the story that I'm telling, and it will show you exactly where he's buried. So really, really useful if you because some of the graves up there are unmarked, or you could walk around for a long time trying to find the person you're looking. You can use this online database. And I do need to point out that although it's called St George's Cemetery, it is public and non-denominational. And so if you look carefully, there's a variety. They're not all Anglicans or Church of England or whatever. It's useful to see. You can't make assumptions. Yeah. Right. I'm running out of hands here. Right. And in 1990, I did a bit of a survey for my studies, and I really got into it. It was fascinating. It's really fascinating. I had a 9-month-old child in a backpack and walked around. It was not as in good condition as it is now, and I can remember at certain points having to be very careful about where I stood. But things that I've looked at, I mean, there's a whole range of things. The type of monuments, the variety of different styles of materials used is really interesting. The type of headstones that are used, whether they be upright, the range of crosses that are up there, Latin, Calvary and Celtic. See, this is stuff that interests me, but when you look, take note of that, because there is quite a variety. There are lots of symbolism up there. Really, really beautiful carvings. There's a whole pile of different lettering styles. There's even a grave site all in German, which we might not expect in Gawler, but sure enough it's there. And then I did things like looked at the earliest date of birth, the greatest age. There's a woman who made 102 who's up there, and we have the tragedy of babies as well. So quite a range. I looked at the places that people had come from, so we're not all England, we've got Swiss and Germans up there as well, where people died. Quite a large area, including, of course, the deaths in World War I, recorded there as well. And there is some beautiful evidence of what the people did. I think we should go back to that. I think if you're going to have a grave, your headstone should reflect perhaps what you did in life. And this is of one of the Baines family, and guess what? He was a beekeeper. I just think that's... And there's actually a sailing ship up there as well, and a whole pile of things. I just think that adds something else. That really makes it interesting. So yeah, I did quite a bit of things, what people died of. I came up with the conclusion that in Gawler at that stage, you either died of a childhood disease, you died as a baby. For women, you had a high risk of dying in childbirth. For men, you died in what we'd call an industrial accident now. But a lot of people in Gawler lived to quite healthy ages. So it's interesting to look at that. We imagine that they all, finished work at 60 and then died. No, not necessarily. Some people went on and got to quite significant ages. Today, there are actually 943 plots up there. In 860 plots and a total of 1,250 interments. So it's not running out of room, as you will see when you visit. There's plenty of space. Now we come to this gentleman called Canon Coombes. He came from London. Now I'm not very familiar with all the hierarchical titles in the Church of England, but bear with me. He starts off as a curate. He then becomes ordained as a deacon and sent out. He becomes the first resident minister here. 2 years later then he's ordained a priest, so I'm not, not quite sure how that happens. Then later he becomes a rural dean, then he becomes a minor canon of the cathedral. So he certainly goes up through the hierarchy. He gave nearly 50 years of service to Gawler, to St George's. So dying just short of his 50 years, which was sad. During the period then, he baptised over 2,300 babies and married over 230 couples. Lots of our ancestors will have his name on the baptismal or wedding certificate. He influenced a lot of people in that time. He was also really active in the community. He was obviously well educated, as were a lot of the rectors here, and they brought those skills to the community in terms of governance and organising committees, but also in terms of literature and entertainment. We'll see that. So they added their value to the community in a lot of different ways, both religious and in community building as well. We've also, it seems to me that we've had a choir associating with the church almost from the beginning. And they did both choral and operatic performances, so they weren't just, a bunch of singers. They were quite talented and quite well organised. Canon Coombes' wife, Eliza, seems to be one of the first people to get the choir up and running. And then they would perform at just about anything. They performed at the Oddfellows Hall down the main street. They performed at the opening of the new organ. They had an alfresco fete and fair, and the choir performed there. They did drawing room concerts over in the hall, strawberry fairs and fundraisers, choir dances, a whole range of things. They're really active. They're very much part of the entertainment part of Gawler. And there's some names that pop out in some of the things, in some of the records. The Beadnors, which are very much an old Gawler name, the Warhursts and so on, so as well. So lots of influence, and again, you may find that you've got family members that were involved in that aspect of the church. Then we had a club, St George's Club. Social, athletic and literary activities for young men. I'm not sure what the young women did, but this was certainly the young men. In 1894 they opened at the corner of Lyndoch and High Street in rooms there, and they within a year moved down Murray Street to the corner of Murray Street and Jacob. I've highlighted, but it's actually rubbed it out. Let me see if I can read. They actually did things like chess. They had a smoking room. They had a library. So it was very much a place where people could come and spend time there. And I think it was a mix not only of young men but older men as well, so very much a social. And the timing is, in the 1870s, we moved into the eight-hour day in Gawler. The founders moved into that. There was a bit of industrial strife, late 1880s, early 1890s. But then we had, soon afterwards, in the 1890s, we had basically a depression. And I'm thinking that what might have happened is keeping people active, giving them something to do if they're not in work. So I think some of these organisations were, yes, people had more time because they weren't working as long, and then if they're facing also being unemployed, this is the point of this type of organisation. And there we go. Martin has, sorry Martin, I haven't put your name there, but there's a letter addressed to London to get some books for the Gawler Club's library. So they were aiming high and getting in good reading material all the way from London and calling for a catalogue to order the books from. The churches also always seem to have exhibitions and performances. We arrived in the 1980s, and I can remember all type of art festivals happening. I can remember purchasing some paintings from an art exhibition that used to be in the Parish Hall. I know more recently we've had the Chamber Philharmonic classical music so we've always had a connection. There's always been people. It's not simply about church services, it's about using that space for performance art as well. And I found something in 1986, festival concerts with Bill Lewis. So I'm sure that some people here know more about that than I've been able to discover. Fundraising, as I say, without that constant government assistance, they suddenly had a lot of fundraising to do. Something they were probably not that used to doing, but they threw themselves in it with great gusto. In 1864, as the church was just about completed, they started to bring in pew rents, which is an English thing. And there were 3 categories, and you had to pay on an annual basis, and you had to pay in advance. And then that became your pew. So all those Jane Austen films you've seen where, the Lord of the Manor goes to the front pew and the rest stay at the back, that was certainly happening. Well, and it happened all the way through into 1907. They kept the pew rents, but they stopped the distinguishing. You could choose which pew that you wanted to rent. And that was a major fundraising. Certainly it was done to raise funds. But they also had to do a whole range of other things: bazaars, raffles, fairs, shops, jumble sales, and generally run by the women of the town. One of them in 1863, the prizes, there were 30 prizes, including an allotment of land, 2 rocking horses, a litter of pigs, hives of bees, bags of wheat, cases of wine, turkeys, and the last prize was 1,000 bricks. Would have been really useful in 1863. You might have got half a house out of it. And they go on, in 1970 we were still having a big fete at Uringa, which is the house of the Law Smiths. And I can remember, it was only a couple of years ago, Bev, that we stopped the annual stall at the village fair. So fundraising continues to this day and probably well into the future. And there you go. That's advertising for a bazaar that they're having to raise funds for rebuilding of the church. These two illustrations are from Martin again. This one on your left is a birthday party being held at Martindale, which is actually a fundraiser for the church, and then you could buy your button as well. So lots of evidence of continuous hard work, right, continuing to raise the money to not only pay the clergyman, but for all that property and all the other social services that they were providing. And here, this is a really interesting, for me, a very interesting picture. We have James Martin, we have Canon Coombs, and we have member for the Legislative Council, H.E. Bright. 3 elderly gentlemen and the rest, and a whole range. This was the tower planning, when they decided to start to plan for the tower, having delayed it for so long. This was the group that got involved, and a fairly formidable group, I think. We also had a literary society for St George's. I think probably there was a young men's society, and I think it evolved from that. Alfred George Wells, who is very much tied up with the Institute, was one of the founders. They produced a magazine. They actually started to win the Union Parliament debate tournaments. So again, there was a whole movement, the Union Parliaments, in teaching citizens how to debate, how to understand parliamentary procedure, how to debate, how to publicly speak. It was part of that development of the working man to have those skills. That was interesting as well. One of the things about St George's is it's been especially supported by philanthropy and memorials, and there is lists of people, and you will see them as you go around. Everybody at some stage has donated something towards the church, and we're really fortunate that they still exist. So you've got lecterns, and you've got chalices, and you've got altars, and you've got porches, and you've got altar stands, and you'll see those as you go through the church. Really magnificent. And a great way to be remembered, actually. But one of the exciting things that's only recently been discovered, because we've all walked under it, the sanctuary light, and gone, oh yeah, it's a light up there. But it turned out to be really, really, I think this is one of Joanna's discoveries. It's by and I'm going to stumble, Wojciech Amrek, I think, Czechoslovakian ecclesiastical artist who's really well known and had a exhibition only a couple of years ago, and it's one of his. So it's actually significant artwork in South Australia, and it's so easily overlooked. And again, it was commissioned by George Dowling in memory of his wife. And if you really have a good look and look up, you'll see some of the beautiful art that's there. It's really quite stunning. We've also always had music in the church. The first piece of music was a clarinet. Somebody played the clarinet, apparently. But of course they've had a series of organs, and those of you who came along to Steve Casler's excellent, I'm not even going to start because Steve had all the information, and if you want more information about the history of the organs, please go and have a look at Steve's presentation on the history website, because it's fabulous. And of course the bells. Now the bells went in September 1921 as a memorial to soldiers, the men of Gawler who were killed in World War I. So the war formally ended in 1919, and they got that up and running, not dissimilar to the time that the Gawler South Memorial went up as well. So Gawler South was a different council at that stage. The church got the memorial up. The major memorial in Gawler, which is the Institute balcony, didn't go up till 1931. There's quite a story about why that took so long as well. So lots of different memorials in Gawler for the First World War. And of course, it's 8 fixed hemispherical bells. It's nothing like what I imagined when I first saw it. Oh, that's the pipe organ. This is the contraption that plays the bells. And for those of you familiar with Brian's recording, you can see that too on the Gawler History website as well. But you can see from that, not the old bell-pulling traditional. These are quite unique, and apparently the only ones in the southern hemisphere, I believe, or something like that. Very, quite unique again. Then we've got the Rectory. So when the church was concentrated, there was a decision not to use the clergyman's allotment on the other side, on the side of Loyau, to build the Rectory. I've got a feeling that Canon Coombe didn't want to live that close to the church. I think he had thoughts that he'd be getting knocks on the door all the way through the night if he lived that close to the business. So they went up to, they got a land grant up on Lyndock Road, and they built a property, they named the property Gulfview, and they built the Rectory up there. Now, it was 20 acres, which is quite a large piece of land. What we do know that in 1876, George Warren came in and surveyed that land and broke it up into 16 allotments. The Rectory was still there, but obviously some of the land was sold off. It was for whatever reason. I always thought Gulfview was on the left-hand side of Lyndock Road, but the glebe land is on the right, so I'm not even sure if I know where the exact position of the Gulfview was. I'd be interested if anyone does know that. But of course, it's no longer there. It's actually now back in Cowan Street. And what happened is, in 1901, there was an exchange of residence between Benjamin Deland, who was the builder. He rented his house to the church, and then he went to live in, he rented the Gulfview house from the church himself, so there's a bit of a swap. His house he had built in 1860. In 1902, the church ended up buying the Rectory, buying Deland's house, brought that into their property, but it waited another 7 years before they sold Gulfview up on the hill to him. So, yeah, interesting. Then we've got the school as well. We've had a variety of schools, not just one. And I won't go through all the details, but it was a pet project of Canon Coombe's to get a school going. And it opened its door in 1850. It had three headmasters, Prosser, Helmore and Gibson. Then we had Leonard Samuel Burton, who most of you have heard about. He was extremely popular. They had to extend the school because in 1853 they actually had to accept all denominations and both genders. And they ended up having to build a separate room for the girls. But the school was also used a bit like a school as a church hall. They had lots of other things happening in that school as well, including Sunday school on the weekend. And again, that's that picture, just to reinforce how substantial it was. Better to have the school near the church than the Rectory, I think. And there you go, it's one of the adverts from Loyau in '61, advertising Burton and his school. But it wasn't the only school, because in 1866 they had outgrown it and they built a new school in what we now know as the Parish Hall. And it's interesting, there's quite a tale. It wasn't bought initially by the church. I think Burton bought the land and gave it to the town, and it had a separate management trustees looking after it. It's quite a story which I won't go into, but it needs to be teased out a bit more. Anyway, Burton ends up resigning from the school and he goes off to be the first headmaster of Gawler Primary School. But he only lasts there 2.5 years. I don't think he liked working under a state system. And he actually, in 1880, leaves Gawler Primary School and reopens St George's. There he is on the left, that's our Burton. Very popular, and all the way through, because it was non-denominational, a lot of Gawler's pioneers, or second generation of pioneers, were taught by Burton, and they are constantly praising him and reminding people that, you know, he was the reason for their success. He lived in Hemmingby, what we now know as Hemmingby, which is in King Street. He took boarders in there, and there's the long dock toilets to prove it, and quite a large amount of residential accommodation. He ends up leaving or separating in 1892. He retires from St George's, but he goes home, and I think he was teaching still at Hemmingby at that point. So for a short while it was actually also a school. The Parish Hall in 1911 has to take the overflow from Gawler Primary School because they've got such large numbers that they actually moved students into the Parish Hall, and for that reason they enlarged it. So the front of the Parish Hall, the 2 rooms, was an addition that was put on in 1911. And then of course there's the story of the planning of Trinity, where classes also started in the Parish Hall but moved out to Alexander Avenue as well, and there's quite a story there. And I was interested to know that the Trinity on Alexander Avenue was opened in 1985, but it's a separate area outside of any parish boundary, so it's not limited. There's no... students can come from any parish across the state to go to Trinity. So interesting from an administration point of view. Lots of things that were taught. I found this list, so reading, writing, arithmetic, but they also did the use of globes, chronology, so dates, English composition, natural philosophy, mensuration, which is the measurement of things, drawing. The girls were also taught plain and ornamental needlework, because that's what every good girl needs. And then another one of Martin's treasures, there's a letter actually addressed to Burton, care of St George's School, Gawler town. That found him. I love the fact that, you can hold in your hand the history. And that we think is about a 1925 postcard, Martin. And again, it shows when they built the hall, it was just under the main roof, but this is the 1911 extension out the front. And I'm guessing we're calling it 1925 because there's Zion Church in the background, so it has to be post 1922. Thank you. That's right, having got its celebration. There was a lot of sport associated with the church as well, just to tell you all of those things. It was a very much, again, it built a community, and it looked after people with whatever they wanted to do. And there were people from the congregation who put their hands up and organised social events. So, foot races, cricket, chess, athletics, tennis, it's all come through. There's all St George's clubs. And there's the tennis courts from the turn of the century, and this one is from about 1900, and this is the Gawler Central Tennis Club. He played on the tennis courts, and it's got it's a photo from the State Library, and it's got all those second generation. It's got the young Barnetts, Robert and Flo. It's got Mayor Deland. It's got the Thompsons and the Riggs in there, all playing their tennis, all dressed up to the nines. We've got stained glass, which we'll see. Absolutely fabulous stained glass. I think it's a treasure. Interestingly, we've got some E.F. Troyes, who's quite a well-known South Australian artist. He's actually a Roman Catholic and the first chair of St Vinny's. But he designed those 3 altar windows, which were dedicated to Canon Coombes. They're very popular. They're so popular that one of them, the Light of the World, is also in St Peter's and Paul's. So he's doubled up in Gawler. So I think that's always really interesting. And there we go. We've also got other treasures. We've got tapestries and kneelers, which I always catch my eyes. Excuse me. There's some of the things. I think that's one of the... It's just like jewels. To stand in the choir loft and look down to all those tapestry kneelers is just something. That's a real treasure. Again, a sign of an active community, church community, who are giving back to the church. And then we have the Young Men's Society. It still existed in 1975, but by then it had been balanced up. There was a ladies' guild, a mothers' union, and a young wives' group. So yes, there were women in the church, and they were starting to get themselves organised and have social connections as well. So that's good to hear. A couple more beautiful... I just think, when you stand there and look at the church, the architecture is beautiful and the stone just glows. I just think it's a beautiful thing. It could so easily be down a laneway in somewhere in England, but here it is in the middle of Gawler. I think it's just beautiful. There are some more things that do need to be researched. If you're interested, I'd love to share this information with you. We know that in the British Online Archives there's a whole amount of information about this Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. And it needs somebody to go through and see what there is in there about Gawler. So that would be a really worthwhile thing, because I think that'll add to it as well. As I said, Julia Hutchinson is really interesting to me, and many other women who supported. They're often just as, Mrs. John Smith. Well, who was Mrs. John Smith and what did she do? L.S. Burton and his schools, I think, could do with a bit more. Certainly all this art literary events that went on in the 20th century. It's probably all mentioned in the Bunyip, but it just needs to be brought together. And last, there's a bit of a move to get a photographic registry of all the cast iron surrounds in both St George's and in the Williston, because there's some, as Joyce knows, there's some particularly beautiful examples which she'll show on her talk, a talk and walk. And there was a cast iron survey done a few years back about all the cast iron that's on houses. There hasn't been one yet done of the gravestones, so there's some beautiful work to be done there as well. And on that basis, thank you very much.
Okay. I did that on purpose. That was excellent, Helen, and I will ask young Robin Richter to come up and give a vote of thanks.
Helen, how did you keep this talk that has so many stories behind so many layers so short? I'm sure you could come back here every week and deliver as long a speech again. I was involved in the church fairly heavily between 71 and 85, and being a fiery, any high work was mine, yeah. And that sanctuary lamp, yep, I did it. I put it up. It is a kerosene lamp. It's meant to come down and go up on a balance weight like the old lights did. However, it is electric. So that was one of my stories. I've got many stories on the foundation stone, and there's just so much. And to answer your question on Gulf View,
yes.
I believe it's the area between Crown Street and East Terrace,
yes.
And the old Rectory, I believe, is the very old decrepit building that is on the right-hand side of Bishop Street going south. There's little cottages on the left,
Yes.
and there's a big house next to the big house next to the nurses' quarters of the old Harch. And I understand that's where it is. But Helen, look, thank you so much. You've done a lot of research, and I'm sure that you've got reams and reams more on that. And just a final thing, the roots and the branches of the Church of England are far and wide. And of course, St George's emanated from St Martin's in the Fields in London.
And you are too? No.
St Martin's in the Fields in London, and St Martin's in the Field of London's bells are in Perth. On the shore there, on the Swan River. Anyway, Helen, thank you very much. And if people like to look closely, they might find a piece of the St Martin's in the Fields Church over at St George's.
There you go.
Look carefully.